We have two excellent speakers today. We have Jim Paul from Ogletree-Dakins. It's an international law firm that specializes in employment law. In fact, they just won an award by the U.S. News and World Report for best attorneys for employment law in the country. So I think it's pretty prestigious, and we're happy to have him here with us today. We also have Adam Erickson from Hanover Insurance. He's a senior management liability underwriter. And we also have his boss, Matt Zazinski, who's assistant vice president of Hanover. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and start. Jim?
Great. Thanks so much, Don. Good morning, everybody. So my name is James Paul. I go by Jim. I answer to Paul because everybody gets my name backwards, but I've also been called a lot of other bad things, so I'm used to anything. You can shout out whatever. And I do want this to be, and I know Adam does too, informal, ask questions. The only thing to be careful about is don't get too specific or too personal or start talking about one of your employees or partners' health conditions or something like that. And we can talk through it. We'll use hypothetical names or whatever else. And of course, we're going to stick around after. I think the presentation is give or take an hour or so between the two of us. And then, like I said, we'll stick around if you want to ask questions after that. Everybody should have received the slides so you can follow along and take notes. If not, I have extra copies up here. And I also have some goodies and giveaways. Make sure you take something on your way out on the table back there because I don't want to lug them back to my office. So today we are going to talk about wage and hour issues, and that term or phrase can either be misleading or scary to a lot of people because what really does that mean? What does that entail? How does that interplay with coverage for potential claims with regard to unpaid wages or unpaid overtime or failed timekeeping records, which is a bigger and bigger issue. So I've been doing this for a little over 20 years. I started law school when I was 10 years old, which is why you're probably confused. But this area specifically has really ballooned, exploded just in the last few years. And it's now become, as you probably have seen and heard, also a state issue or a city issue. So all of you have heard or seen, right? Cities that are passing minimum wage laws and overtime rules, city by city, state by state. Everything is being done more on a local level as opposed to federal law. 20 years ago, state laws and local city laws and ordinances didn't exist in the employment context. It was all federal. All I had to do was worry about federal court. Now we have to worry about cities and states, which is one thing. We do have 50 offices across the country, so thank goodness we can compile all this stuff because I don't care what's going on in California, but some clients do. So I have to figure out what information they need for California, Illinois, Massachusetts, Florida, or even outside the country internationally. So we're going to talk about the new federal proposed regulations. How many of you have at least seen or heard that something's coming with regard to the white collar exemptions? So good, you have at least had some warning or introduction. So how this has played out. So the Obama administration obviously has been around, been in administration for 7 years now, and a little more than 7, and we have a big election coming up. So the other thing too I wanted to say, if Donald Trump gets elected, all of this you don't have to worry about, right? He's going to probably abolish the Department of Labor. Employers can do whatever they want. But on the assumption that we're not going to have that, or we're going to have abolishing of all labor and employment laws, this is something that's going to be important over the next year or so. And it's going to happen much quicker as far as what employers need to be doing. So last year, although we knew this was coming for several years because this was one of the Obama administration's big initiatives, that they were going to increase the minimum wage, really crack down on the overtime exemptions, and do a lot of enforcement in this regard. So last July, leading up to that for a couple years, they actually proposed the rule to change the exemptions, and we'll go through what exactly changes. And I apologize, I have kids that are by themselves and a wife out of town, and I have a federal judge that may be calling and pinging me and yelling at me sometime between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. So I apologize in advance if I have to throw the mic or...
Yeah, if that happens, you're stuck with me.
Then you're stuck with
insurance, so get excited.
Exactly.
That's the fun part.
So I don't, either my wife or a federal judge are the only ones that I respond to yelling from. So, but I potentially have both of those at issue this morning.
Worried about unsupervised children. I don't know.
Yeah, well, yes, and I have 2 teenagers, so that there could be lots of issues there. Anyway, not to talk about my personal problems or issues. So that happened in July. The public comment period ended in September. 290,000 comments almost. Now that's from employees, unions, employers, employer associations, insurance companies, private citizens, submitting comments. Yes, this is great, praising these changes, objecting to these changes, saying that these should be modified or tweaked. The Department of Labor has supposedly gone through all 289,000 of those. By law, they're required to at least look at all of those. Then they review and they prepare the final rule. They've done that, and then they've submitted it to the Office of Management and Budget Review. That is what's in progress now, and that happened about 3 weeks ago. So that literally is hot off the press news that usually takes anywhere from 30 to 60 days. It could be quicker, it could be longer, but this has to be done fairly quick because the Obama administration needs this to be finalized and in place well before the election. So we're running out of time, right? This has to all be done and gone through. Once the final rule gets published and approved by the Office of Management and Budget, then there's going to be another 30 or 60 days until it becomes actually effective. So we're only going to have 30 or 60-day warning at most before it actually becomes final. So we don't know, but it's going to happen before November. And the reason this is important for a lot of employers and employer associations is we got to figure out what to do and make changes before then. And now's a good time to fix some of the problems that we're going to be talking about. So if in your organization or your company you realize that there might be some holes and things or gaps to fix or change, now's the time to do it because we can do it. And I'm doing more of these audits, more of these implementing changes now, so that when the regulation changes come out, we can kind of all group it together and maybe gloss over the fact that we, the employer, has been doing something wrong or unlawful for the last few years, okay? So think about that as we go through this. So you may know that to be exempt from overtime, the general rule is it has to be a white-collar type job, and there's a whole definition of duties and exemptions that might apply. But the person has to be paid a salary that can't change week to week. They get an automatic salary every week, no matter how much or little they work. And it has to be at least $455 per week or $23,000 annually. Now, all joking aside, those amounts and those numbers have been on the books for 30 years. We can all probably agree that someone making $23,000, $24,000 is not at the upper end of management or administration in any company or organization, unless it's a not-for-profit organization. And unfortunately, if there are any not-for-profit or religious organizations in the room, the law doesn't make an exception. The law applies to all employers, usually with just a couple of employees, and it doesn't matter if you're not-for-profit or religiously affiliated or everybody's working out of the charity and goodness of their own hearts and taking a $23,000 salary. This law applies to everything. And that's one of the big objections, and there are court cases that have already been filed to try to stop this, at least stop it with regard to its effect on religious organizations or not-for-profit companies. So that's a whole nother area or issue. So that $23,660 is now potentially going to double, which is a big jump, right? Yes, it's been 30 years at this amount, so it probably should be increased, but what the Department of Labor has done is says it's going to double, or at least double. So we are anticipating somewhere around 48,000, maybe 50,000, and it changes annually. So whatever the first number is, we're going to have to watch this and potentially increase someone's salary every year based on inflation, the economic conditions, cost of living, et cetera, because based on that economic data each year, the Department of Labor may raise this amount. So maybe it may start out at 48, but then in a year it goes to 50, and the next year it's 52, then it goes back down to 50, or whatever happens. Although I'm guessing that they're going to put in a mechanism that it never goes down, right? It's only going to go up. So you can see that there are drastic changes. And what we're telling people now, if you haven't already started to do this, create a spreadsheet of all jobs within your organization or your company that you are treating as exempt, And you may need to go back after today and figure out who you're treating as exempt or non-exempt, because some of you, not you personally, but your companies may not know exactly or have it very clear who's exempt or non-exempt. Once you do that, make a spreadsheet of all the exempt employees that are somewhere between $24,000 and $50,000. Because those individuals, you have two options. Well, you have three options. The one is ignore all of this and hope for the best and hope you don't get a claim or sued. Probably not the best advice or the best approach. So putting that aside, there's only two options. One is you're going to convert them to non-exempt, have them clock in and out or keep track of their time, pay them hourly, and then pay them overtime for more than 40 hours in a week. Second option is to bump them up to whatever that number is, to the $48,000 or to the $50,000. Now, someone who's making currently $47,000, that's not a big deal. Presumably, you could bump somebody up $1,000 and keep them as an exempt employee, not have to worry about overtime, keep everything the same. But what if they're making $35,000? Is your organization, your company, going to increase their salary by $15,000 just because of this regulation? So those people that are in that gap, in that hole between $25,000 and $50,000, basically, you're going to have to make a tough decision. And of course, budgets and finances and everything else come into play. And how much do you increase people? Even putting aside potential favoritism or other discrimination issues, are you increasing some people but not increasing others? That could lead to another set of different types of claims if females aren't bumped up but males are, or if there's differences based on race or disability or age, et cetera. So
to that point, real quick,
yeah.
On the insurance side, and I've got a few things we'll touch on throughout the day from a risk management standpoint, things your brokers are discussing. But a wage and hour type of claim is very rarely brought just as a wage and hour type of claim or a violation of FLSA. It's brought in conjunction with discrimination, harassment. That's why when you're looking at this is covered under what's called an employment practices liability policy, part of a management liability program. They call it a modular policy. We can get more into detail on that in a little bit later, but something to keep in mind as he's talking through all of this is it's very rarely brought just like this. So if you are only bumping the male salaries, not the female salaries, that's not just going to be wage and hour. That's going to be brought as a larger claim for discrimination. So there's always a different component there. So when you're going through this, that's one of the key things to remember. It's not just a singular issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Adam is right. Most lawsuits or most claims that we see and defend are ones that have several, or at least a few different types of claims. So it may be a federal claim, a state claim, it might be a retaliation claim, a discrimination claim. All of those can be wrapped up into one, but they're still distinct issues. So since we only have about an hour today, I'm not going to necessarily talk about discrimination, retaliation, and harassment, but be aware that the wage and hour laws that we're talking about all have a discrimination component, and they have an anti-retaliation provision. So, for example, if someone complains that they didn't get overtime or they weren't paid properly, and then they're fired the next week, that is in addition to the fact that they could have a claim for overtime pay that they didn't receive, they have now a retaliation claim because they complained, or at least they tried to ask about what they're getting as far as what the law requires for overtime pay or minimum wage, and then they were fired or retaliated in response to that. So that would add a whole nother claim, a wrongful discharge claim. Correct. Or a wrongful demotion claim.
And that's the vast majority of what we see. And then it's on folks like Jim to sit there and sort through what exactly happened. Because that attorney is going to take everything they can find and throw it against the wall. And they're going to see what sticks. That's just the reality. And the other piece of that, the other component from an insurance standpoint, a risk management standpoint, is even if you follow all of the new laws, you do everything perfectly, you can still get tagged in a lawsuit like this. They're going to claim it. They're going to see what happens. And you're still going to be responsible for the financial piece of that. As brokers discuss with you, ultimately insurance is transfer of risk. It's a financial management tool. And that's what this is, because if you did everything correct, we still have to prove that, unfortunately. So that's another piece, another component to look at from a financial standpoint.
Absolutely. And the second part of this, after I talk about all the potential mistakes or pitfalls, is how to do good documentation and retention of those documents. And Adam and I were talking earlier, before we started today, that a lot of these cases are he said, she said, right? And not so much in the wage and hour, minimum wage, overtime claims if there are time records, because the computer can spit that out. You can pull time cards from boxes that are in storage or that are on the shelf or whatever. But guess what? A lot of the times those records don't exist, or they've been lost or not kept or not retained, or there was a fire or a flood or whatever else. So you have records for a reason, because you don't want a he said, she said. And another problem too is for salaried exempt employees, which a lot of everybody in this room potentially is treated as exempt salaried employee. You don't keep time records, right? Because you don't have to, and the time records don't matter because you're paid a salary no matter what, or at least a salary plus commissions, or whatever your compensation structure is. So at the end of the day, if there's a claim and all of a sudden someone says, well, you shouldn't have been exempt, guess what? We don't have time records. So we have to go back and recreate based on he said, she said, or based on someone's memory. And rest assured, if one of your employees is quizzed or questioned by the Department of Labor and they're asked, you didn't keep time records, so how many hours did you work every week for the last 3 or 4 years? What do you think the employee is going to say? Oh, I worked exactly 39.5 hours every week. I never went above 40. No, they're going to say, at least once they figure out that there might be some advantage for them to say that they worked some overtime, oh yeah, I worked at least 3 or 4 hours of overtime every week for the last 3 years. And if we don't have documents to contradict that, it's going to be a he said, she said.
Documentation is the ammunition we give Jim to defend. Really, the more we have, the more effective he can be at defending the organization and at going out and making this, we don't want to draw this out. Ending it quickly, it's giving him like the proverbial knife to a gunfight. We want to give him something better to fight with. So documentation across the board and all things HR, what he's talking about here, the more you have, the better off we are on the whole.
Okay, so any questions about this or what? So your first piece of homework, and yes, you have homework after you leave here today. I can't monitor that or supervise that, but your first homework would be to go back and make that list, of individuals who are treated or classified as salaried exempt, but they're somewhere between $24,000 and $50,000, because you're going to need to make a decision with regard to them in the next few months. So start that list now. Was there a question?
Yes, so here's my question. So I have 10 employees at the top line there that make $23,660, and I'm barely keeping my doors open. I'm a small manufacturer. So I either close my business or I try to do the same with 6 or 5 people. Have I discriminated or wrongfully terminated or committed any kind of liability by having to lay off or terminate those 4 or 5?
There's so many questions.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, have I created a employment practices exposure for my company where the decision is, do you close the doors or do you do this?
Yeah. So, I don't want. First of all, I don't want this to be all doom and gloom. Although, it is what it is, and it is raining outside. I didn't pass this law. I didn't propose these regulations. We lobbied, of course, to have a lowered level and to exempt out small. It'd be nice if there was an exemption for employers. 50 or less employees would have a different level or a different requirement, or they were exempt from that. Unfortunately. Or financially constrained or not for profit. Unfortunately, as it sits right now, there is no such exception or exclusion. There are lawsuits that are trying to force that or require that, because this is going to be drastic. This is presumably, at least according to who you ask, going to lead to downsizing, layoffs, restructuring, or converting people from full-time to part-time, or whatever the case might be. So yes, there are going to be issues with that. Someone could always claim that you're picking and choosing between employees based on some discriminatory reason, right? So what I would suggest, if you are choosing to lay off somebody or to downsize, that you make sure you have very clear objective factors on how you're doing that. You could use a strict seniority system. That's objective, right? Nobody can question that or say that that's based on race or gender or age if you say, we're just going to use seniority. Now, the reality is you have good workers, great workers, mediocre workers, and not so good workers, right? So you may not want to use seniority because you want to take this as an opportunity to make decisions based on what? Performance or productivity or attitude or whatever. But that gets into more subjective area, and certainly the risk of some type of discrimination claim is going to be there, right? And it's going to increase unless you're dealing with all white guys under 40. So you don't have to worry about claims from them, but claims from anybody else are going to be a risk. But at least you're going to have some. I mean, you're saying, I didn't wake up one day and just decide to do this for fun. I'm doing this because we have to change our pay structure and our classifications, et cetera. So if you have a legitimate reason, such as this, that's going to be, at least get you there halfway with your explanation or your defense.
My awkward laugh as a result of that is more because the position you just described is very common, and one of the more, we're seeing an increase in claims, and part of it is driven by an aging workforce. So when you're in that situation, you're looking at who you're going to let go, how you're going to cut the costs. In a lot of situations, it is employees with longevity who are receiving the largest paycheck. And that's a difficult situation to be in because there's usually some type of age protection there. And it's really, you're not going out with the intent to discriminate, but once you let go of somebody over a certain age, or has been there a certain amount of time, it does create that environment. And what I was speaking to earlier, you don't actually have to engage in discrimination, but they can claim that. And it's still going to look that way if that's the only individuals you let go. It could be you let go of 2 individuals who are over 60 years old because they're getting closer to retirement, is an easy transition, and you're saving some money on their salary. You can bring in somebody younger to do it for cheaper. But it does increase your chances of seeing a claim or seeing some kind of accusation. And that's where your employment practices policy will be triggered when that is brought up. And I cannot emphasize enough when you're speaking with your broker, if you have anything that sniffs like that type of a claim, like it's either a notice, it doesn't actually have to be a notice from the EEOC, just a note from an employee or somebody bringing up in conversation. Talk to your broker because your carrier who's handling your employment practices wants to hear about that immediately. This is not where you're going to be penalized for bringing a claim and they're going to increase your rates and things like that. It's because if this stuff does start to boil up, we want to get it in the hands of someone like Jim as quickly as possible, so we don't incur a bunch of other issues, or it makes it a lot cleaner and easier. So really engage your broker early on if you think anything like that is happening.
Keep in mind, these are claims-made policies. They're not a notice or occurrence policy. So if you get some kind of notification like that, you got to tell the broker so we can report a claim.
Depending on your policy, there can be restrictions about how much time you have. As soon as practicable wording is usually what you'll see in all these policies, but some will restrict you of 90 days or 60 days in order to report that claim. And if you don't do it in that set time, the carrier is going to come back and say it wasn't reported to us timely. There's some gray area there with regard to your state and how it's handled, but it's just easier to say we got it in, we don't have to worry about that particular piece. Do you have a question?
The answer is no, unless the bonus is guaranteed and paid week by week. So the problem is this is a weekly salary requirement. Remember, $455 or $900 or whatever it ends up being per week. So you have to be paying that guaranteed week to week. Anything on top of that is just literally, no pun intended, a bonus, right? It's icing on the cake. But you can't say, look at the whole year and say you've made more than the 50 for the whole year. You have to pay week by week a set salary. Commissions, bonuses, other incentives, on top of that is all icing. Now, you may have to do away with those if all of a sudden you're bumping someone up to $50,000, but you can't include that. Does that make sense? Which is frustrating, I know, and confusing, but it has to be a set salary, guaranteed, and paid week to week. And it can't deviate. So if someone works half a week or half a day one week, they still get their full salary. So again, here's your homework for your first item is go back, do that audit, create the list, make sure you have clearly stated in your company which positions are exempt and which are non-exempt. It should be on a job description. Hopefully it's in an offer letter to somebody so that everybody's on the same page and they know whether they're exempt or non-exempt. Now, something else I wanted to say about the question about, I'm a small business, I only have a few employees, I'm gonna have to either lay off people or shut my doors, which I hope doesn't happen, but I know that's gonna be a real concern or an issue for a lot of companies. Realize that all this, and now I sound like the Obama administration, but this requirement doesn't require you to pay the $50,000 to anybody. All it requires is if they're not getting whatever that magic number is, 50 presumably, that they have to be non-exempt, their time has to be tracked, and if, and only if, they work more than 40 hours in a week, a 7-day period, you have to pay overtime, meaning time and a half. So if you don't allow somebody and you prohibit and make sure and monitor the overtime, then there isn't going to be that requirement to pay the overtime, right? So you can control and say, hey, we can't afford, we don't have a budget, we're not going to pay overtime. And you can figure out the hourly rate that keeps them basically at their same compensation from what it was before, right? You just take their $30,000 salary and divide that up over how many hours they're expected to work for the year and say, don't work overtime unless I tell you to work overtime or unless you get pre-approval to work overtime. And then you're at least minimizing your financial exposure to that. Does that make sense? So that sounds better at least than having to close your doors or lay off people. Because the law doesn't require you to hire anybody or to keep anybody hired or to pay anybody anything other than the minimum wage. But if they're not meeting these requirements, then they have to be eligible for overtime. All right?
So everyone has to be converted to hourly, or can they continue to make a salary, but we pay them for overtime?
So the question was, does everybody who's not meeting the salary requirement, do they have to be converted to hourly, or can we pay them a salary but just then pay them some amount of overtime? So the answer is, it depends. And for those of you who have heard me or other attorneys speak, the answer we always give is it depends, right? Because we don't want to give an answer or we can't give an answer. You can do that. For purposes of this discussion, and we can talk offline, definitely consult an attorney. You can have a system set up where someone's quote salary, but they're really non-exempt and hourly, and then you track the overtime. You can do that, just make sure you're tracking the overtime. You're gonna have to figure out what the true hourly rate is, which is gonna change, despite the fact that you have the salary, it may change week to week or pay period to pay period based on how many hours they're working, because you gotta track the hours now. So the difference is not necessarily salary versus hourly pay. The difference is tracking the time and paying them more on an hourly basis versus just the automatic salary, right? You get $2,000 a week, period, and we don't care how much or little you work, at least until you're not working enough to suit our needs and then you're fired, right? But you need to convert them. If you want to keep a salary just for purposes of ease of administration or peace of mind for both the company and the employee, that's okay, but make sure it's set up where the time is being kept and the overtime is triggered, and then you figure out the right amount for the overtime. Because overtime is based on what's called someone's regular rate of pay, but someone's regular rate of pay can change from week to week or month to month based on how many hours they're working, especially if they're on salary. They work more hours, what does their average regular rate of pay do if they're working more hours but getting paid the same? That rate's going to decrease, right? If they work less number of hours, but they're still making that same overall amount, then actually their regular rate increases. And that can change week to week, payroll period to payroll period, making it very confusing. And so time and a half is a complicated formula. But so the answer is yes, you can do that, but you got to be careful.
Jim, can I put you on the spot and ask you a question?
Sure. Absolutely. I love being put on the spot. As long as you're not a federal judge asking me questions.
I'm not, and thankfully I'm not. Technology. Can you give us your thoughts on the role technology has? For instance, I get home at night, been traveling all day. I sit down, I start working on my phone, answering emails. You have employees. Technically, that's working. How is that changing?
Now you're skipping ahead. I know you looked at my slides. Everybody looked at the slides. So I forget which. No, that's pitfall number 7. But yes, Adam's absolutely right. In this day and age, everybody I say everybody, most employees, most people have phones, have email, have Twitter accounts, have texts. If you are allowing employees to receive work-related calls, texts, emails at night, over the weekend, guess what? That time, I'll say potentially, because there's what's called the de minimis rule, meaning if someone picks up their phone and responds to one text a week that takes 5 minutes, that's not going to be enough to make anybody excited. But if they're doing it routinely every night for 30 minutes, an hour, or over the weekend for a couple of hours responding to calls or emails or texts, that's work time. And somehow your system needs to be set up to capture that time, either input it electronically into a timekeeping system, or come Monday when the person reports to work, they have to fill out some form or log it in how much time they worked. And luckily, there are ways, and you'll see the Department of Labor has helped employees track their time on their phones, because the Department of Labor has its own app that it's telling employees to download so that they can keep track of their own time and compare it to the time records that you as their employer keep. But even without that, obviously, I mean, all of us can go on, we can count the emails, count the texts. They're usually timestamps and date stamps for phone calls. I can calculate all my phone calls in the last week and how many minutes I was on my phone for a particular purpose. So that can all be recreated. It takes a lot of work, but it's, at least for some period of time, it may vanish after 2 weeks, right? But I have my log or my history, and so do your employees. And so does your company server, right? If they're sending and receiving emails that are going in and out of your, through your server, you can track that. The other thing you can do, and then we'll talk about it as pitfall number 7 or whatever it is, you can also shut off employee access, or make sure employees don't get texts or work-related calls, or don't give them a company phone if they don't need it, or they got to turn in their phone or pager at the end of the day. I have a lot of clients that have a policy, if they're a driver or a worker that gets paged or needs a phone throughout the workday, but they don't want or need them to have it at night or over the weekend, they got to turn it when they clock out, or when they leave, they put it in a box, or they put it in their locker, or they turn it into their supervisor. That's another option. I mean, it could get just as crazy as, I collect things at night from my kids because they've been known to wake up in the middle of the night and play games on their phones. So I collect my kids' phones. Putting in that same analogy, you can collect your employees' phones.
Yeah, that's a tough situation, because a lot of organizations are moving away from providing technology to the bring your own device type of an environment. So it's hard to say, hey, by the way, hand over your cell phone. Oh, it's my personal cell phone. I'm not giving that to you. But it goes back to documentation. What are the guidelines when they're hired on? What do they understand they can and cannot do? Documentation is key to all of this.
And I'm really not trying to scare you. Well,
Yes,
I am kind of trying to scare you, because I would rather not have to be in federal court on your behalf, like I am potentially this morning for somebody else. But the Department of Labor has now made it so easy. Employees, this is on the website, but there's also an app. Employees can download it. They can file a claim from their phone, from their computer. All the regulations, the law, the FAQs are all up there. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, employees, it sounds bad, but they didn't have as ammunition the ability to just go Google something, print out something from either an employee side attorney's website or the Department of Labor website. But now employees are becoming way more educated. Of course, part of the problem is they don't really understand, and so they think something applies to them or doesn't apply to them, and they're wrong legally. But they have all this ammunition, and the Department of Labor is making it very easy. So just be aware of that. Your employees are looking into this. Whether or not they have an attorney to talk to, they have the Department of Labor ready and willing to provide the easiest way to answer their questions or for them to file claims.
But in summary, so if they're over the 50,000 limit, it's not an issue that we need to worry about. If there's a commission salesman or something, they're making $70,000 a year, it's not somebody we need to worry about.
Well, yes, except, as we'll talk about in a second, that salary amount is only half of the test. So to be exempt, someone has to meet that salary, and they have to meet what's called the duties test. Has anybody heard of the duties test? So I'm seeing some people. It's a big misconception out there. I think it's my number 1. So again, you guys you're trying to skip ahead here or try to preempt this, but there's a misconception that just because someone's outside sales or fully commissioned, or they're making more than 50,000, that's the end of the test, or that's the end of the question. that's half of it. So the 50,000 is half of it. They still have to fall under one of the exemptions, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But in a nutshell, you either have to be a manager and supervise 2 or more employees and actually have power and authority to supervise them. You have to be a professional, so an engineer, an accountant, an HR professional, a dentist, a doctor, a lawyer. You have to fall into either the professional manager or the administrative exemption, meaning you're doing company or organization administration with a lot of independent judgment and discretion and ability to make decisions on behalf of the company. So a lot of us have that, but a lot of employees that are put in that category really don't have independent discretion or judgment to make important, and it's defined as matters of significance for the company. So there's the salary part, but then they have to fall into one of the other categories too. So don't be fooled that just because someone's getting, at Ford or Chrysler, the auto workers that are on the assembly line, especially if they're working overtime and at their union rates, they could be making over $100,000. I actually had one of my grandfathers worked at Chrysler. They could make a lot of money, but there's no way that somebody working in the auto plant, in auto assembly, no matter if they're making $100,000 or $200,000, they're not exempt, right? So they still got to fit into one of the categories. So number 10, make sure that you either prevent or you don't allow overtime to be worked if you don't want it to be worked. So you can control the overtime, and you can fire somebody if they work overtime when they were told not to work overtime. The irony is you still got to pay them, but then you can fire them. Interestingly, the Department of Labor doesn't care that their employment is preserved. All they care about is that they're paid for time that they actually worked. Now, I say that half in jest. Be careful. Obviously, you don't want to fire someone if they complain about overtime, because then it's retaliation and it's another type of wrongful discharge claim. So make sure that you have policies and you're monitoring employees and working overtime. If you know about it but you're just kind of turning the other way, I really don't want to know what's going on, but I know people are coming in over the weekends or coming in early and they're working overtime. If you know that it's happening, and if your computer system or the employee's phone shows that it's happening, you're going to have to pay it. But you can put things in place to make sure that employees aren't working that if you don't have the budget or the interest in having employees work overtime or the need. So make sure that management approval is required. Put that in a written policy. Maybe even put that in a poster, and I can send you sample posters that I've created over the time clock or the badge scanner or whatever. Say that there's no working off the clock, don't punch in and out for another employee, and if employees aren't following your procedures for clocking in and out and not working overtime, discipline them. You can discipline them, and then eventually, don't do it for the first offense, right? Give them a warning or two before they're fired, but you can fire them or discipline them if they're not following your procedures. As Adam said, as I've said, you need the documentation, so you need people to clock in or input their time correctly. And so if they're not following your you create whatever procedures or policies you want, then they're disciplined or they're warned or they're eventually discharged.
Is if you don't have enough documentation to do during this course of this process, things like this, the previous slide where you have those details outlining what they should or should not be doing, you also need to clearly communicate that to the employees themselves. It's great if you have that in practice, but if they've never seen that, and it has not been communicated to them, it's a different layer of claim we could see where they're saying, well, I was like, oh, they never told me any of this. I wasn't aware of any of this. So communication and documentation, again, popping up is very important in how we handle all these different changes and updates.
Okay, so number 9, and so this comes into play, failing to pay for off-the-clock work. So this would apply to working evenings or over the weekends if they're responding to pages or texts or calls or emails. And of course, our technology allows all of that, for better or for worse. I kind of wish, when I first started 20 years ago, we didn't have phones. We didn't have emails and texts like we do today. So a client couldn't get a hold of me until the next day at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock, right? Well, now, unfortunately, and judges can get a hold of me, because of our technology. Well, make sure that employees are getting paid for that if they're not exempt. Now, again, this one is only going to apply. There's no such thing as worrying about off the clock or overtime if someone's truly exempt. So if they're meeting the salary and the duties test, or they're 100% commissioned salespeople, then you don't have to worry about this. But for anybody who's not exempt and is eligible for overtime, you have to make sure and track this and have policies for that. So review your policies, your routines for workers, review technology. What devices are you giving? What devices are you requiring employees to use and respond on? Make sure managers know not to tell employees, you better check your voicemail or your emails every night or over the weekend and get back to me. Make sure your managers understand to tell employees or to not write off their time. I've had this happen too, managers who then go back in the timekeeping system because of course their budgets don't allow overtime, right? So if they're going to get charged or get in trouble for their employees working overtime, what's the incentive for a manager to do? To try to hide or take or deduct or take off. Hopefully none of you have had that happen. It comes up unfortunately way too many times and leads to bad evidence and claims, but certainly claims and liability. So
some of the worst claims we have the best of intentions, and that's an individual trying to do their job the best they can within the constraints they have, weren't necessarily trying to walk down that path, but best intentions, terrible consequences.
So you can create the rules and procedures and the gameplay here, but don't be the ostrich and just kind of ignore when people aren't following that or they might be working and not putting in for their time. So, number 8, failing to keep time records. So, if someone's truly exempt and we're 100% sure they're exempt, we don't have to worry about overtime, we don't have to worry about timekeeping because what? If you work 10 hours, if I work 10 hours a week, you work 10 hours a week, or you work 60 hours a week, you get your same salary, right? If you're truly exempt from overtime. But if you have to be tracking that for hourly employees, make sure you have those, make sure you keep it. The law requires you to keep those for at least 3 years. In California, it's 4 years. And I haven't really talked about, everything I'm talking about is federal law. Every state, potentially every city, but for sure every state has its own rules. Most of the states, a little more than half, just basically copy the federal law. But the states on the East Coast and the states on the West Coast have their own. So it's a whole new world in California, Oregon, and Washington, and Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut. Make sure that you're complying with state rules, and I can, if you have workers or facilities in different states, I can provide you with each state's rules on this, but it gets really complicated. But keep those records at least for 3 years. I tell people, in my world, and in Adam's too, it'd be nice if you kept records forever, because I can guarantee that as soon as the 3 years hits and you get rid of something, even though you're not legally required, or at least it's my luck, right? As soon as I go in my basement and get rid of old stuff, the next week I need it, right? Or someone asks about it, or someone wants it. So keep it at least 3 years. If you can keep it longer, great, because it may become useful. It may be good evidence to show a history or what some other employee did or what you did as a company under some old policy. So if you can keep it longer, but then you have boxes of stuff, it's scanned in, it's taking up space on your server, you have 10 gazillibytes of metadata somewhere stored on the cloud or in servers, and your IT people are saying, we can't afford to do any more. We got to purge this stuff or delete this, right? Or start to overwrite. That's fine. I understand that. In my perfect world, you'd keep stuff a lot longer than 3 years, because who knows when you might need it, and it could be a very good piece of ammunition or evidence in a case that might make or break it. So that's just a little bit of, hey, keep it as long as you can, but at least 3 years or 4 years if state law requires it. So keep those. Make sure employees understand that they have to clock in and clock out. Another thing, do employees have to clock in and out for lunches? That's a whole nother pitfall that we'll talk about, but that has to be a policy and procedure you set up. You can automatically deduct lunches. That's a problem if people aren't really taking their lunches. Our legal assistants in our office habitually eat at their desk and then work while they're eating. Well, guess what? They're non-exempt, they're entitled to overtime, and so technically, if they're doing a little bit of work, they're not taking an unpaid lunch. So we have to crack down or say, which is a good thing anyway, hey, step away from your desk, because if I see you at your desk, I'm gonna assume you're working and I'm gonna ask you something or want something, right? So make sure that people are properly categorizing or clocking in or out for lunch periods. Again, 3 years, I recommend 6. So it builds in a little bit of a cushion, and you might need stuff longer than the 3 years. Okay, so this is what I was talking about before. Supervisors or managers making adjustments on someone's time records. Well, they clocked in at 7:30, but they were really just sitting around drinking coffee and reading the newspaper for the first hour. So I'm just going to write that time off, or I'm going to clock them in, adjust that time for 8:30 instead of 7:30. Well, that may be the case, and you may be able to do that, but you need to have the employee sign off on that and agree that they weren't working. A manager shouldn't do that unilaterally. Now, if you have surveillance, if you have eyewitnesses, then you need to tell the employee that you're going to do it, and tell them to sign off on it, or discipline them. What? Because they weren't working for an hour. You don't have to pay people if they're not working, but you need to monitor that and discipline and do that. Don't let supervisors, and we've done this in several places, we've turned that function off. So if you're using a vendor or have a payroll system, ADP or whatever else, there are functions that you can turn off or not allow certain users to do. And one of them is adjusting the time. You can turn off that function so that a certain manager or supervisor doesn't have the authority. It has to go through you or go through somebody else before that's approved or adjusted, right? But if managers are going in and they're changing times and deleting and adjusting things, that's very dangerous unless, obviously if someone forgets to clock in or forgets to clock out or lost their badge or whatever, that's fine, but make sure the employee's on board and that's signed off on and very clear what you're doing. It's all above board. It's not done behind the scenes secretly by a manager.
It's particularly difficult to communicate this piece of it because it's a changing environment. The regulations are forcing us to look at our employees differently and look at our organizations differently. And when you go in and you say, well, that hour you all take where you sit around the break room, you read the paper, great for employee morale, great for the community, and it's a time for them to get to know each other, always a big benefit. But if you go in there and say, by the way, we're not going to pay you for that time any longer, changes dynamic, changes the relationship with the employees. So that communication piece can be very difficult for all that. That's where it bleeds more into our area of, it changes the way they approach their managers, changes the way they approach the company. So it's a very difficult item to communicate a lot of the times.
Yes, great. So again, and all this comes down to training and policies, which is where I know from, I'm not going to ask for any volunteers to raise your hand that you're admitting that your training and your policies are not up to par, but I know it's out there. So make sure you do the training, you have the policies and procedures so that you are at least set up to comply with this and stuff's not falling through the cracks. If you're rounding, so the question is, if someone clocks in at 7:53, but they're not supposed to start until 8, yes, you can round up. It has to be in the 7 or 8 minutes. You can round up or down. You can't round more than 7 or 8 minutes. And you have to not always round up. You have to round up or down. And sometimes it's going to benefit the company. Sometimes it's going to benefit the employee. For instance, if someone after their shift clocks out 8 minutes or more after their shift, you have to round up, to the next quarter of an hour. So the idea is that with rounding, if you're always doing it up or down, no matter who's being advantaged by that, then it all averages out, right? Sometimes it's rounding to the company's advantage, sometimes it's rounding to the employee's advantage. But don't always round so that it benefits the company. That would be impermissible. Make sure your system is set up. Some of you may know what the rounding is, and some of you probably have no idea. So you need to check with your vendor or your time card system or whatever. Don't let supervisors adjust that. Again, if everybody's, the employee says, sorry, I clocked in early or I forgot to clock out, so yes, I will handwrite and sign off on this change that I stopped working at 4:30 or whatever the time is. So number 6, failing to properly record or monitor pay periods. So can anybody tell me the difference between a break period, and again, under federal law, California has really, really complicated meal period requirements. Missouri and Illinois don't. But under federal law, who can tell me the difference between a break that's paid and a meal period that's unpaid or can be unpaid? Does anybody know? 15 minutes. Anybody else have a guess or answer? That's very good. Technically, it's 20 minutes. And I will say in reality, it's probably 30. But here's the rule, and you nailed it on the head. The difference is if it's 15 minutes or less, it's automatically assumed to be what? A break period that's not long enough to be unpaid. So for an hourly non-exempt worker, if they go out, take a smoke break for 10 minutes and come back to work, that's technically paid time. Now again, people can complain about employees taking breaks or going to their car or doing whatever for 10 minutes 10 times a day, because that adds up. So what are you supposed to do? Well, you start disciplining that. You tell them, no, you can't, well, you shouldn't chain them physically to their desk or to their work area, but unless, well, that's a whole nother issue, yes, or you're in another country, but yes. But short of that, if you see or notice them taking 10 smoke breaks or 10 other breaks, and you tell them there should be one break in the morning and one break in the afternoon, you can discipline them for that and eventually fire them. But all along, the time has to be what? Paid. You can't deduct pay because it's not more than the 15 minutes. Now, the problem is leave it to the Department of Labor. They say that usually it should be 30 minutes before it becomes unpaid. 30 minutes of uninterrupted personal time, meaning someone can't be checking their emails or voicemails or can't be responding to calls or doing other work while they're eating or taking their lunch break. It has to be 30 minutes of uninterrupted, peaceful lunch break or enjoyment of music or TV or whatever, or sleeping in their car, so that it can be unpaid. Now, what they also say is that maybe 20 minutes is enough. So unfortunately, we have between 15 minutes and 30 minutes, we have this gray area, just like with everything else. Nothing's ever, that's when I'm going to say it depends, right? So use 15 minutes. Clearly, anything 15 minutes or less needs to be paid, and it's a break as opposed to a meal. Anything 30 minutes or more is clearly a meal period that can be unpaid for an hourly worker as long as they're not doing any work on the side or while they're eating. Between 15 and 30 minutes, it gets gray. So make sure that there's enough of a period. It really should be at least 20 minutes. To be 100% safe, you want the 30 minutes. So again, educate employees and your supervisors. This all comes down to policies, procedures, and training on what should they be clocking in and out, when are they supposed to take their meal period, how many breaks do they get, is it paid or unpaid, how many minutes, what time of the day, do they have to be does someone have to fill in for them or cover them while they're on a meal, or do they just shut down and go on a break whenever they need to? All of those things should be laid out.
Circling back, it's easy for us to stand up here and pick on Department of Labor and talk about these different areas we have to adhere to. But I want to circle back to that cultural piece and communicating this. The most successful companies I've dealt with over the years in changing that culture, that individual's taking 10 smoke breaks and saying, we need to knock this down a little bit. We need to change how you're doing this stuff. A lot of them have seen success by clearly communicating to the employees the impact that their actions are having. Going through this stuff, helping to understand what the impact is on the organization, where it can provide issues, and really communicating that very clearly to them involves them in the process and helps them understand that. So like I said, it's easy for us to go through this stuff. That cultural component that everybody worries about, those individuals have been there and just don't like change. That piece in engaging them can be such a useful tool in changing that culture and moving more towards all these new guidelines and all the other fun stuff we're discussing today.
And part of the problem is it's frustrating, right? Because you may have, our legal assistants, it's a good thing that they understand, that they're ready to take the responsibility if their lunch is interrupted and they got to copy something or print something or send an email. That's great that they have that engagement and responsibility to do that. The problem is that no good deed goes unpunished, right? And all it takes is one person to complain about that or claim that they were really working and not getting paid for it. And then the Department of Labor comes in, or an attorney comes in and is filing a claim on behalf of everybody in that same job category. So the problem is even if we have one, what I will call disgruntled legal assistant in our office, that person can make a claim that therefore subjects all of the legal assistants to an audit or to scrutiny. So you can see that it's dangerous to make exceptions or allow people to work off the clock or through their lunch, even though you know that person, they're loyal, they're responsible, they want to get the job done, they want to do a good job. The problem is that the next person that comes along isn't going to have that same work ethic, or they're going to become disgruntled. And all of this wage and hour stuff, unless you have one-of-a-kind person in each job classification, it affects all workers in that same job or at that same location are all working at that warehouse or working under this procedure or these time system. Does that make sense? So yes, I always say 80% of an HR professional's time is spent dealing with 5% of the troublemaking employees. And that's pretty much been true, and I've anecdotally tracked that. So unfortunately, all it takes is 1 or 5% of your employees to disrupt or to cause problems or cause claims.
Nobody's ever had that employee, right? That one that just loves to complain all the time. Doesn't mean their complaints aren't valid from time to time, but it's infectious, like you were saying, and somebody can step in. So you actually have to, oh, it's just Bob, he's complaining again. Well, Bob might actually have a valid concern, and if he doesn't, somebody else may think it is, and it catches on. So you have to be careful with that person who's got that reputation.
Okay, number 5, comp time. Who can tell me any guesses or any definitions of what comp time is? Has anybody heard that term before? So some people are nodding their head. Anybody want to shout out? What is comp time, or what does that term mean? Everybody's scared. Well, it's kind of good that you don't know, because the reality is, unless you are a government, city, county, state employer, you can't use comp time. So what comp time is that, hey Joe, yeah, you worked 50 hours this week. Now again, we're talking about hourly non-exempt people. If it's an exempt employee, we're assuming that they can be working 50 hours in 1 week, and maybe the next week they take it a little bit easy. But for an hourly non-exempt employee, if they work 50 hours 1 week, you can't say, okay, well, we'll pay you 50 hours, but next week just take 10 hours off or take a day off, and then you won't have overtime. Can't do that unless you're a government public employer. So you can't allow someone to just write off their overtime in 1 week and save it and take time off in the following week, okay? You can do that for government workers, but not for a private, even not-for-profit worker, unless it's government or public employer, you can't do this. So be very careful and make sure that and I've had situations where managers, supervisors have worked for the government and they've had comp time, so they assume that they can use it when they come to your company. They can't. It only is for public employees. So make sure that everybody knows and understands that so that that's tracked. So homework number 2, we've been talking about more than 40 hours in a week. Well, what does a week mean? Any guesses? Is it Sunday to Saturday? Is it Monday to Sunday? Is it Wednesday to Tuesday? The answer is it depends. I told you the answer to everything is it depends. You as employers can create your own 7-day work week. You can start it at noon on Wednesday and end at what? 11:59 the following the following Wednesday. You can create your 7-day period. You can do midnight at Sunday and 11:59 on Saturday night. But you have to create it, and your employees need to know what it is, your managers need to know what it is, your payroll vendor needs to know what it is, your timekeeping system needs to know what it is. So homework number 2, go back, make sure someone knows, or that it's in writing, or that employees are told and managers are told what the heck is your 7-day period, because that dictates whether someone's working more than 40. Does that all make sense? Sounds easy, but don't raise your hand. You don't need to admit that you don't have no idea what your 7-day period is, but I know that there's at least a couple of you out there. So go back and check.
Is that still what I would understand it to be, that that 8-hour day does not drive you into overtime if they work 33 hours in that week? That's how we understand it to be. So it's bonus week.
Well, okay, what I think you're asking is it's by week. You only have, in Missouri and Illinois, you only have to worry about more than 40 hours in a work week. But there's a handful of states, including California, that require daily overtime. So if someone works more than 8 hours, you got to pay them, even if they only work 35 for the week. If they work 9 in one day, then you got to pay them 1 hour of overtime. You don't need to worry about that in Missouri and Illinois, but if you're in other states, again, mainly California, the East Coast and West Coast, check, because there may be a daily overtime.
35 hours, and they get a holiday, and you're not
Yes,
open. So
it's actual work time. So vacation, holiday, even if they're getting paid, but it's sick pay or vacation pay or holiday pay or personal vacation day or whatever, or short-term disability, that's not work. It has to be work time. So it may show up as paid time on their pay stub because they're using PTO or sick pay or whatever. It has to be actual work time. Does that answer your question? Okay, independent contractors. This is a whole nother workshop. I could talk all day about this. How many of you, again, you don't have to admit this, but I bet there's some of you, how many of your organizations use independent contractors? A few hands go up. Well, I'm telling you, all of you use independent contractors. You may not realize it or think about it in that term. Do you have someone who comes in and cleans offices? Do you have someone that cleans the windows or cleans the carpets? Do you have a landscaper that cuts the lawn or does the, shrubbery or washes the windows on the outside? Those, if you're paying them to do that job for your facilities, or do they come in and maintain your copy machines, your computers? Those are independent contractors. Those are all examples of legal, perfectly legitimate independent contractors. So you may not know it, but you have independent contractors. You may also have, quote, independent contractors that really should not be independent contractors. They should be employees. The reason it matters is because you're not paying Social Security and other taxes on those individuals. They're getting paid 1099. Their compensation is issued on a 1099 instead of a W-2. You need to make sure and go back and look at that, because 90% of the people that are doing what your business normally does, so if they're making widgets, if they're sorting things, if they're building things, if they're selling things for your company, guess what? They shouldn't be independent contractors. So talk to an attorney, make sure that you have a solid independent contractor agreement, and make sure they fall in a category that should really be an independent contractor, because this is, putting aside the overtime rate changing or the salary level being doubled, this is probably item number 2 on the Department of Labor's radar. If a company classifies someone as independent contractor. So 1, you got to have an agreement, make sure everybody understands the issues, make sure it's legal, check with legal counsel that they should even remotely be considered an independent contractor, because if they're misclassified and you've been treating them as an independent contractor, Department of Labor, IRS, the workers' comp, I have 2 cases right now where the workers' comp agency in Missouri is imposing fines and penalties on a company because they were under 5 employees and really didn't need workers' comp insurance if they didn't want it, but they had 20 independent contractors that, guess what? Most of them should have been employees. So now they're having to pay significant penalties because they did not have proper workers' compensation coverage.
Big caveat to employment practices liability policies you're dealing with. And the reason your broker puts the application in front of you, asks a very specific question about independent contractors, is different carriers, domestic carriers specifically, which a majority of you will be placed with, handle independent contractors differently. Some, they're automatically included as part of the language as a insured individual. So if anything pops up, whether it be wage and hour or discrimination or a third-party case, they'll be included. Other carriers want to know that, so they don't automatically include that independent contractor in the language. So you have to identify them and then add them via an endorsement to the policy, which would just add them to the language as an insured individual. So when you're speaking with your broker, come renewal or even midterm, saying, hey, we do have 4 or 5, especially if you go through the process of identifying who actually qualifies as an independent contractor. Oh, shoot, we have 2 or 3. You give your broker a call and say, hey, we have these. Are they going to be considered in our coverage? Can we make sure they're part of the definition? Because that is a caveat there that we will see claims come in. Now, ours automatically includes this, but I've worked for a number of carriers, and we've seen it where claims come in and said this individual is bringing this claim, and, well, they're not insured on this policy, and we look at the application, and we say we weren't aware that you had this exposure. So it's something you need to be cognizant of when you're having that discussion at renewal time. I know we all love our renewal discussions about insurance, but it's something very important, and like you said, they're really focusing in on us moving forward.
One of the other caveats is some of the domestic carriers also put a caveat related to you must indemnify those independent contractors as an employee in order to provide them coverage. If you're not, then technically there's no coverage.
It's a really good point, and it's your decision at that point whether or not you want to indemnify them as the employer. So it's a conversation you have to have, and again, document. Because if you're going to extend that coverage, you're really going and extending your coverage to somebody who was not part of the equation when you started your organization. So you have to document that and make sure that you are providing that. Good point.
You've answered the 20 questions with them, which is what we use as the defendant. Okay.
In Missouri. So you may have heard the IRS has a 20-factor test to determine if someone's an independent contractor. Missouri uses that. Illinois does not. Most states have their own, or they have some modified 20 factor. So you may have a situation where someone in Missouri could be an independent contractor, but across the river in Illinois, Illinois state is going to say that they're not an independent contractor. So this becomes a very big problem, and I guarantee in California it's going to be 10 times harder than anywhere else to win on a claim that someone's an independent contractor. So you need to check, again, with legal counsel or check the rules. But yes, the federal IRS standard, there's a 20-factor test. Someone doesn't have to meet all 20 factors to be an independent contractor. It's kind of a balancing test, but you want to make sure that you check the right boxes in the vast majority of those 20 factors. It can get very complicated.
But we probably shouldn't extend coverage to somebody that meets those requirements, right? If we're operating in the
Well, that opens up a whole nother can of worms, because yes, if the policy is defined,
that would help undo the independent contractor
Yes.
status if you're all of a sudden classifying them from an insurance standpoint.
it could if it's not worded extra carefully. Now, D&O coverage or other errors and admissions, maybe. I mean, you can speak to this on how that.
We actually have a program that I put together for misclassification of independent contractors under a D&O policy. It provides a supplement for fines, fees, and penalties related to the IRS, the DOL. What we're seeing is something that we didn't anticipate, is independent contractors bringing wage and hour issues, saying that we're working and we're not getting paid overtime. Their employers are simply saying, well, you're not employees, you're independent contractors. They're filing suit. And what we're seeing is, no matter what the documentation is, unfortunately, and it's to Adam's point, is no matter how much documentation you have, somebody can file a suit. And we're seeing is if the government or the DOL or whoever prosecuting doesn't believe that they are independent contractors, the documentation that you have doesn't matter. And they're going to say these people are employees and you need to pay them as such, giving them full benefits, so on and so forth. And if not exempt, paying them the previous overtime. And that's what we're seeing. So it's not even the misclass issue, it's a wage and hour issue, because that's the hot topic and that's what they're trying to get.
Yeah, and the Affordable Care Act, of course, throws a whole bunch of wrench into a lot of that, because that may play into whether, if you're an independent contractor, you're not entitled to employment benefits or to be counted as an employee. But if the employer's wrong about that, then guess what? They should have had that coverage. They should have been protected. They should have got the fringe benefits, and they're entitled to overtime unless they're exempt. So all these things click in, and they're entitled to unemployment for which you haven't contributed into the system because you weren't making those deductions out of their check, because you weren't doing it as a payroll check, you were doing it as a vendor check. So it opens up a whole can of worms, and workers' comp gets involved if the person gets injured. So it can be a big problem. So look at that. That's your third, am I up to three now? 3 assignments for your homework. Go back, take inventory, unless they're a landscaper, a copy machine repair person, appliances, floor cleaner, carpet cleaner, they may not be a real independent contractor. So if you're using them as an independent contractor, make sure that that's correct. Training time, travel time, I get lots of questions about this. Nothing in the new to my knowledge, in the new regulations changes these rules, but a lot of people don't understand them still. So if someone is required or suggested or recommended to go to training, even on their own time, that technically has to be compensable work time. Again, we're only talking about non-exempt employees. All of us that are salaried and exempt have to come to, you have to come to this, right? And you're not getting paid anything more to suffer through us talking about this stuff. But for an hourly non-exempt individual, that's work time if they're going to training that's required or recommended. If it's totally their decision and the employer just says, hey, our employees may want to go to this class or to go to this seminar, but there's no repercussions if you don't. If you do go, we're not going to use it as a bonus criteria or promote you because you do. Once you start including some incentives for them to go, then guess what? It becomes work time. So you got to track that. Even if it's on the weekends, if they're going out of town, you got to count that time. And also for the travel time, you have to make sure that if they are traveling during the times of their normal workday, even if they're traveling out of town and not technically working, then that has to be compensable time to them. And if on the weekends they're working, say their hours are normally 9 to 5 or 8 to 4, on the weekends, if they're working or traveling between 8 and 4, they got to be paid for that time. So that can be very confusing too on the travel time or the training time. Is there a question?
Does the training, does that include, like, if you're helping pay for extended education or, towards
Tuition reimbursement?
things like that, does that?
No.
That's not
No.
considered?
So if they are, and it's, as long as it's not required, well, as long as, and you want to make sure that there's a policy and they sign something that they understand that it's voluntary, or at least there's no evidence that says, well, you don't have to take this class or get this certificate or this degree, but, wink, wink, nod, nod, you better do it, otherwise you're not going to get promoted, or, you won't last here or whatever. So make sure that it's truly voluntary. If it's tuition reimbursement, the way that we usually think about it, no, that wouldn't be covered. But make sure your policies and your forms clearly say that this is not work-related, it's not required, it's not, appreciated by the company. Now, the problem is they could be attaining education or further education that does benefit the company or allows them to be qualified for a promotion, right? And that's okay as long as it's not required for their current job. But if it's to allow them to be promoted or to transfer or to take on additional responsibilities, then it's not work related for their current position. So look at what their current position is. Yes. Yes. Again, if it falls under the required or highly recommended, or you're going to get a bad annual review. Yes, yes. So that, and the reason that we got to count it as work time is that if in that 7-day period, remember, you're going to go back and check what your 7-day period is, that they go cross over 40, then that time is going to be, whatever is above 40 is overtime. Yes.
What about, like, meal times? Let's say an employee goes to visit a supplier in another state, and then that supplier takes them out to dinner. Is that dinner compensable?
So what's my answer? You guys, it depends. If it's purely social, no, but there's always going to be a work-related or sales incentive type component. So if they're hourly, non-exempt, and they're entertaining or talking to clients or vendors, that time, yes, is going to be considered work time, at least up to a point. I mean, if you go to a ball game or you play, a round of golf, maybe not the whole time, but some of it could be attributed as work time because you're selling or talking or schmoozing or whatever with your customer or your client or your business partner or whatever. So usually non-exempt hourly employees aren't engaging in those types of activities, but if they do, and it's obviously possible, make sure that you know what, and you clearly define what should be work time and what's not. So we already talked about this, impermissible deductions from pay to some extent, but obviously, and this freezes up every once in a while. That means I was talking too long. So you're taking out FICA, you're taking out unemployment tax, state and federal, you're taking out the income tax. If it's the person's working in the city of St. Louis, of course there's the city earnings tax that I think I just saw yesterday that it passed or it's retained. They were trying to overturn that 1% income tax in the city of St. Louis. All of those are permissible deductions. But if you're taking out things such as damage or lost uniforms or lost equipment or lost phones, or damaged equipment, or you're fining or penalizing employees for doing something wrong, make sure that their pay, again, we're talking non-exempt hourly, if it brings them below the minimum wage or you're taking impermissible deductions from their paycheck, that's a separate violation. So if an employee owes you money or you gave them a loan, that has to be dealt with separately. You need a separate written agreement between the employer and the employer to be able to take deductions. So final paychecks. A lot of companies want to hold back or keep the final paycheck if someone doesn't turn in their phone or their laptop or their car. Don't get me started. I had one client who fired an employee that had a company car and forgot that they had the company car. Didn't figure it out a month later until they started getting ticket notices for not renewing the plates. Anyway, if they have a car or a computer or a phone or a uniform or keys, you can require them to return that, but you can't hold their final paycheck. You still got to pay them, and then you either have to get them to sign an agreement to take the money back, or you need to sue them in small claims court, or do whatever you can. But be careful with making deductions or holding their final paycheck. Okay, so here's number one. There were a couple of questions relating to this. So it's not just pay them $50,000 and we're good, right? We don't have to worry about this. That's only half of the test. They can be salaried, but there's still another part to this exemption. As I said, they have to be an executive or manager and responsible for 2 or more full-time equivalent employees and really have authority to hire and fire and discipline them. Or they got to use discretion or independent judgment for, and I left this off, again, this could be a 3-hour seminar, matters of significance for the company. So if they're deciding which coffee service to use, that's not going to fall under this, okay? So don't say, well, yeah, they order our pens and pencils and highlighters and the copy paper we get. That's probably not enough discretion or independent judgment on a matter of significance. So go back and look at those. Professional, again, those are the accountants, doctors, dentists, engineers, lawyers, HR professionals, CFOs that really have a higher level of education or degree to be able to qualify. Outside sales, if they're actually outside of the workplace, visiting customers, calling on customers or vendors, then they can be exempt too. And they can be paid on 100% commission even. So they may not even make minimum wage, because if they don't sell, they're not getting paid anything. But you can also have inside sales or hybrid salespeople that have a combination base plus commissions. What's my answer on whether someone who's inside sales or partly base and partly commission and whether they're exempt? Answer is it depends. I need to look at, or somebody needs to look at their compensation plan, their commission schedule, their job description to figure out if maybe they fall under one of these, or there's a couple of other very specific ones. So there's a retail sales exemption. It's very complicated. I'll be happy to look at whatever you have in place for somebody and tell you whether they're exempt, but these are the basic ones. Did you have anything about that? Okay, so we only have a few minutes left, at least to keep on to the 9 o'clock, and I'll stick around if there are any questions. This all leads up to what we've been talking about from the very get-go. Make sure you have proper policies and procedures in place, that you have the proper documentation for timekeeping purposes, for discipline purposes, for discharge purposes, because all of that's needed when a claim comes. So Adam's going to ask, I'm going to ask, your attorney's going to ask. I need documentation. I need to know what the write-ups were, what the discipline was, how much time this person worked, when they clocked in and out. You can't control everything or stop a claim from happening, because anybody can make a claim. But you implement whatever policies and procedures you want, and if you train your supervisors and managers and your employees to comply with that, at least you'll have the evidence or the ammunition you need. So you can manage your risks better and either avoid claims altogether or assure that you're going to prevail in that claim or settle it for a very minimal amount if you have everything in place as far as policies and documentation. And if you have to do an investigation, which I always tell people, an investigation could be a 5-minute investigation to make sure that Mary didn't call Jane a bad name, right? That could be 5 minutes talking to Mary and Jane. Or it can be a high-level FBI-like investigation that takes a few weeks and interviewing dozens of employees. I do investigations that last 5 minutes. I do investigations that last 2 weeks or 2 months. It could be anywhere in between. It doesn't have to be anything formal, but if you need to get to the bottom of some dispute, issue, claim, disagreement, accusation, whatever in the workplace, document who complained, who the witnesses are, what you did in response to that, to at least show that you heard the complaint. You may not agree with the complaint or really care about the complaint, but at least create a document that looks like you care, right? Or looks like you looked into it and dealt with it. If you find misconduct or performance failures, document it. Annual performance reviews are great, but they only are a snapshot every 12 months. Or like most clients that I see, it's every 12 months, but then usually it's delayed 2 or 3 months because they don't do them on time anyway. So make sure that you have constant feedback, both positive and negative. Sometimes it's good to give positive. I always hate talking about the negative stuff, but that's mostly what we see, right? We only see the negative, but you should be documenting and rewarding good behavior or good performance as well. So if
And it's very important to document that as well. Not just the bad, document the good, because when they come back and say, well, they never did this,
So for harassment, so sexual harassment, racial harassment, harassment based on religion, employers can be subject to very high liability for that. But the good thing is, if you have policies in place that, one, say, we're not going to have any harassment here, zero tolerance for sexual, racial, religious, any type of harassment. But if it happens, complain about it and we'll take care of it. And if someone doesn't complain about it or let you fix it, then there's no liability. But if you don't have a policy, you don't have training, you don't tell employees who to complain to or how to complain, and it happens, guess what? If it's done by a manager or a supervisor, the company's automatically liable.
That's a great point. It's something people overlook frequently is how to complain. We have a lot of situations where individuals feel they've been wronged or they're in an uncomfortable position and they don't know who to go to, or it's the person they're supposed to go to who's actually committing the infraction, which unfortunately happens more frequently than I'd like to admit. So having steps in place that if you're not comfortable here or an anonymous hotline, there's a number of different methods you can go provide for them to give feedback or complaints. But that's a big piece that's often overlooked that we will ask, and the brokers in here have seen the applications way too many times. But we're asking all the questions he's talking about right here, from what policies you have in place, progressive discipline, anti-harassment, do you have a handbook, are they signing the handbook? But part of the questionnaire is always going to be, do you have a method to bring these complaints?
And have at least 2, if not 3 avenues. So these chain of command, you must follow the chain of command. You must bring your complaint to your direct supervisor first before going to HR, before going to someone else. That's great, except what if the supervisor is the one who's engaging in the harassment or the improper conduct? You have to allow some other avenue or detour or backdoor for that. Otherwise, the claim is going to be there and you're going to have liability.
Yeah, I would say really quick too, to Adam's point, the application, use that as a risk management tool when you're filling out the management liability applications. We ask all the questions that are important. If you use that as a sort of a level set as to what your policies and procedures are, it's a good sort of annual check to make sure that they're all up to date.
If you answer no on a question, what is that question, and is something can be fixed easily? And a lot of your carriers, pretty much again, all domestic carriers, are going to provide you with tools and resources to implement a lot of these policies. They have programs put together with different law firms, different experts that you can go in and actually implement, use some of the language, use them as a resource to implement these policies. So there are resources out there readily available through their insurance programs and the carriers that you can use to help kind of tighten up these controls.
So you got to have documentation. I get calls all the time. Jim, this employee, they've been a terrible employee for the last 5 years. We want to get rid of them. Finally, it's time to terminate their employment. So what's the first question I ask? What do their performance reviews look like? What kind of documentation is there? And what do I hear back? Well, we didn't deal with it. We should have dealt with it for the last 5 years, but we want to deal with it now. They want to go from 0 to 80 without any documentation. You need to have that. You need to show the correction of negative behavior, reward of positive behavior. You need to provide those legal defenses.
Very key point. Notice what he didn't ask first. It wasn't gender or race or religion. It's documentation. It really doesn't matter. Those are big key areas that are going to trigger litigation. But if you have everything documented and everything's written down, it doesn't matter. But you have to be able to go through those policies and follow them in order to do things on the legal side.
So I quiz supervisors, and when I'm doing training for frontline supervisors, and they say it takes too much time or I forget to do it, that's just laziness. That's not a good excuse. It's too confrontational. I don't want to have to, confront the employee or argue with the employee. Still not a good defense or argument, because you're going to need to deal with it at some point. Better deal with it now rather than 5 years from now. I don't want to say anything wrong. Well, yeah, if you say something stupid like, yeah, I want to fire Joe because he filed a workers' comp claim, then don't create a document saying or send an email saying that. I can show you several examples of emails that say exactly that same thing.
Emails never go anywhere, by the way.
Emails are documents. So the other thing I was going to say is, when I say document, it doesn't have to be a company form, a government form, any form that an attorney gave you, a Post-it note, a napkin, a text, an email, a Twitter account, a Facebook printout. Those are all documents. Now, some of them are better to use than others, but they're all documents. And emails can be preserved, printed. They can be forwarded to 200 people with just hitting one button. Very dangerous. So don't worry about saying something wrong unless you're saying something wrong. But you need to have the documentation and make sure that you train supervisors and managers enough not to say something incredibly stupid or wrong. Well, I'm scared of getting sued if I create documentation. Well, yeah, but you should be scared of getting sued no matter what. And if you don't have documentation, it's going to be worse for you. So finally, the real reason is they're not trained or required to do that as part of their supervisory duties, and without it, it's just going to be impossible.
That the fear of lawsuit is a big one. I used to work with an individual. I used to refer to insurance as sleep better medicine. And the reality is, when you're worried about saying something wrong, you're worried about the different regulations, everything that's popping up. When you're talking to your broker and you're talking about employment practices or any of the other types of policies out there, ultimately what you're doing is giving yourself the confidence to go out and do your job as best you can, and knowing if something does happen, whether you create an infraction or not, you have the financial resources to defend yourselves and keep your company going. A lot of the firms that take large losses struggle financially for the next few years if they don't have this policy in place. I mean, not many people are budgeting for a $250,000 loss out of nowhere, especially when it's going to stretch on a matter of months or even years. So that's a big piece of that conversation, risk management piece, is that transfer of risk, but it's also just allowing you to confidently do your job, knowing you have almost a safety blanket back there.
Okay, so anything can be a document, but you want to make sure that you have something to fill in the gaps for memories or people leaving. If you have a piece of paper or an email can be printed into a piece of paper, that's much better evidence. I'm much happier walking into court with paper than just someone's memory or lack thereof, or a he said, she said that has no basis whatsoever. So again, there should be some progressive type discipline. Unless if someone comes in and they punch or stab their supervisor, they're going to get immediately fired and probably prosecuted or hopefully prosecuted. But for performance, attendance, mistakes, there should be at least 1 or 2 warnings prior to the discharge stage.
What kind of time frame is adequate for that step?
So
you realize that the employee is that there's a problem, and you sort of documented and you're documenting. At what point do you have enough documentation that you time over a time frame?
It depends.
You stole my answer. It totally depends on the circumstance. Again, depending on how severe their conduct is, if it involves violence or threats of violence, then terminate them right away. If it's performance or making mistakes and it's happened once every 8 months, you got to determine how when's enough, and do they get 2 written warnings or a final warning? Do they get suspended for 3 days because you need to wake them up and say, this is serious, you can't keep making these mistakes, or do you just fire them? It totally depends, and it depends on how much adversity you have to risk, because sometimes it's better to get the person out of there, especially if they're causing a negative culture or negative attitude for everybody else. And then yes, you have a risk, but hopefully you have coverage so that that risk is there. You have coverage, but that's the better angle because you just want that person out of there.
I know we're getting close on time, but anecdotally to what he's talking about there is I had one very nasty one where we had an individual 2 write-ups for altercations with other employees. Wasn't let go at that point. The 3rd time was actually a very bad one where they had the altercation. They sent the individual who was on the receiving end home. The individual had the 2 complaints, was still there, runs out the front door, pulls the person out of their car at the stoplight, and proceeds to have another altercation. The lawsuit we had to deal with there wasn't necessarily, so that person, when they were let go, the one committed the assault, of course, immediately brought a lawsuit saying, hey, it was discrimination, they were just picking on me, based on one of the protected classes. The subsequent lawsuit that we had was from the employees around them about, you knew this person was an issue, an ongoing issue, and you didn't let them go quick enough. We created another unsafe environment. It's another area that could trigger our defense. But something to keep in mind, to your point right there, sometimes it's better to let these individuals go and create a more conducive environment.
And rehabilitate the workplace, because one person can be like a virus or very infectious in a bad way in the work. So all of these factors need to be, to answer your question, look at all these factors, and at the end result the answer is it depends, because what all are we dealing with here? Yeah, where was the question? Yeah. So the question was, At what point does a lot of documentation that nothing is done about it become a detriment? Because the argument is, well, you let it go on for so long that obviously it's an okay practice. Yeah, that does become a problem. Now you can fix it, and as long as you say, okay, time out. It's now, April 1st, January 1st. We know that we've done this. This has been the practice. People have gotten away with all kinds of things. But we just want you all to know, employees and supervisors and managers, that as of this day going forward, we're starting over. And we're not going to let this go on. So if you have that kind of awakening moment and everybody's put on notice that we're not going to just let these attendances or tardies slide like we have for the last 5 years, then you can do that. And at least you have the documentation to show that it was talked about or reminded or warned, but now you need to start doing something about it. But you're absolutely right. That's going to get you in a rut or stuck where people are just used to getting notices that they were late or absent, but nothing's done about it. So you need to say, okay, fine. It obviously didn't work before. We had this less formal policy, and we just wrote you up and warned you, but it's not being fixed. Now we're implementing this new policy. 2 warnings and you're out, or 3 warnings or 3 absences without an excuse. But you got to lay the ground rules and say, from this date forward, here's going to be the new plan, right? No matter what we've done or not done in the past. Yeah.
And that's communicated to everyone, not just the employee that you're disciplining.
Well, sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that now maybe you do it to them first if they're the only one or the real one that's has that issue. But what you want to do is you want to roll out. It doesn't have to be bells and whistles and pizza and party type of atmosphere, but you need to somehow convey, whether it's by email, policy, a weekly meeting, or whatever, that hey, we know that this has happened before. We're going to stop doing that. And going forward, here are the new rules, or here's the new policy on that. And you got to disseminate it to at least all who's affected or potentially affected by it. So again, I put in some things. You need to have, anytime you fire somebody, you need to have some reason or cause. Now, economic conditions and needing to lay people off, that's a good reason. Bringing weapons to work or stabbing your supervisor, that's a good reason. Being late 3 days out of every week on average, that's a good reason. But you got to document and show that, because otherwise when a claim comes, you're not going to have a defense or an argument on why they should have been terminated. And it's going to be assumed that it's a discriminatory or unlawful reason, right? Well, if you can't articulate a good reason why you fired this person, a judge or the EEOC or the Department of Labor is going to assume it's what? Because of their race, because of their age, because they complained about not getting overtime. It's just going to be imputed on you as an employer unless you show otherwise. This is homework item number 4. All of you in the room and your supervisors and managers are subject to individual liability under all the laws that we're talking about, the wage and hour laws, the discrimination laws. So you can be sued in addition to the company. Your supervisors can be sued. So if you need to smack some heads together and get your managers and supervisors to understand that why this is serious, why they need to document, why they need to follow your policies, it's because you and them can find yourself as a co-defendant along with the company, and that raises coverage issues, doesn't it, Adam?
Absolutely. And within those policies, you're going to find an entity, you're going to find the insured individuals, which will range from manager, owner, all the way through every level of employee need to be named as potential defendants or actually defined within those policies in order to trigger coverage. But it is going to, you don't want to create gaps by not having that coverage in place, or like you said, they're going to name everybody different types, and the organization itself can be held liable as an organization.